Okay, so why is argument construction important? So, argument construction is really important because there's a specific tier of analysis that is necessary in trying to effectively communicate any given idea. And the reason why this is important is because you'll find out, in our practice today on Wednesday, as well as in the coming tournament that is happening this weekend, you have a very limited amount of time, especially since, people who were able to attend our novice training day yesterday got to talk about, very complex and nuanced issues, right? So, for example, like the role of media in people's lives, the reality of living as a queer youth, for example. We talked about housing policy. And, those are topics that you probably can't reasonably cover every single aspect of in only 5 minutes time, right? And later on in 7 minutes time when we do like the university level like tournaments. In which case then, when you have such a little amount of time, it is so crucial for you to make the best possible argument for your case to be as efficient as possible with the time that you're allotted. Let me actually like time myself so I don't talk for way too long for this seminar. Okay, yeah. So there are three main benefits to deconstructing an argument, right? So the first is it becomes organizationally clear. The second is your logic becomes more sound. And the third is the argument becomes more convincing because it appeals to multiple levels of understanding. And again, this is really important because if you're able to do all of this in a very short time frame, after learning the skills of debating and how to structure your arguments and stuff like that, you're going to be able to use your time a lot more efficiently. You'll be able to cover more ground with your arguments, and every single one of your arguments, even if you spend not too much time on them during your speech, is going to be very robust and hard for other teams to kind of take down in the refutation. So that's why structure in your speech is very, very important. And as a quick note as well, structure in your debate speeches is very similar to academic essays from my experience. So, I went from, having like getting like 70s or something in my like essays in my first year to basically I haven't gotten an essay below like a 90 since like, year three. And the reason why is because the way that you structure arguments in debating is very similar and has a very lot of transferable skills they can use and apply to any kind of academic setting as well. So I think you get a lot of benefits that way too. All right, sounds good. So here we're going to deconstruct some of the main components of the argument. So the first is there's 5 different tiers of analysis that I want to talk about. And people who attend a novice training day might find this familiar. People who haven't might find this a little bit new. But at the bottom line, there's 5 main components that I like to talk about. The first is the claim. The second is the characterization. The third is the mechanism. The fourth is the impact, and the fifth is the importance. And we're going to go through what each of them are, slide by slide. But I'll give you guys like maybe 10 seconds or so to kind of just like write this down. Don't worry about like all like this part. Just write down like the claim, characterization, mechanism, impact, and importance. And the reason why I want you guys to write this down is because I found it, at least like when I was learning debate in my first year. It was really useful for me to kind of keep these like 5 like words like on my paper. And when I'm making an argument, I kind of just like fill in the blank, right? I write, what is my claim? And then I write, what is my characterization? All right, what is my mechanism? And then impact and importance. And it becomes a lot easier for me to kind of organize my speech because I find otherwise my notes become really messy and my speech kind of goes all over the place. Okay, so we're going to take this motion as the example for today, which is this house will legalize, tax, and regulate all substance use, or more important, substance production, or as a better way of saying it, this house will legalize all the drugs. So this house will legalize all the drugs. Let's say, and you don't have to agree with this argument, but we're kind of just using it as an example. So let's say the claim that you want to make, or the argument that you want to make, is that is that we should legalize all the drugs because this will make people safer, i.e., it will stop people from consuming laced goods. For example, like buying weed that's laced with like fentanyl. That's been the result of a lot of people dying in the past. This is a little bit outdated now that like weed is like largely legalized. Who muted me? Okay, sorry. This has like largely been what do you call it, legalized, so it's a little bit outdated, but I think the principle of like how to make arguments still like rings true. So don't worry too much about whether or not this is topical enough or applicable to like the status quo. This is mainly just like to highlight the different components of an argument. So anyways, let's say you want to talk about or argue that legalizing the drugs will stop people from consuming laced goods. As such, it will make people safer. That's going to be your claim. And the reason why this is important is not just, oh, well, Tyler, obviously it's important because, you have to make clear what you're saying, right? It's important for two main reasons. Important because it makes clear to the judge regarding the intention of the argument and what specific benefit that you're trying to prove exists. This might seem kind of like obvious because you're kind of just like, well, yeah, isn't like what you have to do? Like, doesn't everyone do that? Not really. It's actually oftentimes the case where a person can make an argument, they can talk and talk and talk, and the judge will just go like, I have no idea what they were just talking about or what the point of that argument was. So having the claim and making a very clear point title is really important for making your speech organizationally a lot clearer. The second is that it makes it clear to yourself what the next step is. So it's basically asking yourself the question, what do I have to prove next to ensure that this claim is true? So now you know, well, the next few steps, I have to characterize what the world looks like. I have to talk about why legalization necessarily leads to better outcomes in terms of like people's health outcomes and stuff like that. So this is why the claim aspect of this is really important. Next is characterization. So characterization is also known as world building. And as a lot of people in like novice training day probably heard me talk about, and I guess I'll mention it today as well, is that think about world building the same way that you would think about how do you say this? Like an author setting the scene in a book, or for example, a playwright setting the scene in a play. You know, we're giving the backstory of certain characters, right? The reason why we care about certain characters, the reason why we care about certain aspects of an individual character in like books and stuff like that, is because we can connect to them on a deeper level, right? This is why, for example, we're less connected to characters that have less developed backstories. We're less connected to characters or books or like movies or shows or like just stories in general that don't really have a properly built up world. Because we don't really find it that easy to connect to those things. So this is the exact same principle as making arguments, right? And characterization is basically what I call setting the scene. You want to give the listener, or in this case, the judge, relevant context and information to help them understand why they should care about your argument, as well as how they can connect to your argument. Because very often a judge can listen to an argument and be like, well, I understood what they were generally saying, but I don't really understand like what exactly they were getting at or why this is particularly relevant to the round. So characterization is really important because you want to add more depth to your arguments that way. So this would kind of look like explaining what the world looks like with and without the policy being implemented. So as an example here, you could say the status quo is characterized by people having to purchase substances like marijuana or like weed illegally through private dealers. This is because there is no legal way to buy it like you can with alcohol. So this is very simple. Obviously, when you put this in a debate speech, you want to expand a little bit more on this, but I think this highlights the point pretty well. Because notice here how I'm not actually making an argument yet, right? I'm not actually saying what policy we should or shouldn't do. Rather, I'm just kind of describing, here's what the world looks like, Judge. The world looks like a world where people consume these products illegally through private dealers. This is because there's no proper way to get it like you can with alcohol, like going to your LCBO or something like that. And that's how you can characterize what the world looks like. So the goal of this, or like what this is achieved, is like the judge can be like, now I kind of get an idea of what the world looks like, right? I kind of know exactly what the issues are in the status quo. So then the next part, you can maybe talk about explain what the world looks like with the policy being implemented. So you can describe, for example, in our world, people are much less likely to consume privately produced marijuana because there are more legal ways to obtain it, right? So for example, you can say legalized marijuana has meant that in places like Canada and parts of the US, this has made people have better access to safer types of marijuana. And this is kind of like the part where you're able to throw in the examples that you know, or the specialized knowledge that you know, right? So if you know of a law, you know of a place that, implemented a certain policy, you can add that in here because that is all part of characterization, all part of world building, setting up the scene for the judge to really understand what the world looks like. Because I say this a lot, I tell this to my debaters a lot, which is basically always imagine, always try to imagine your what do you call it? Your judge as someone who just doesn't know anything about the world. So you have to really go through the step-by-step process of laying down the foundations, of explaining to them, here's what the world looks like, here are the issues that exist right now. And then you can go into the actual part where you argue why your solutions are better or why their solutions are worse. So that's kind of what I mean by world building. And if you have any questions you can just put them in the chat and I can answer them insofar as they're related to the topic at hand. Yeah. Okay. So this is world building or characterization. So the reason why this is important is for three main reasons. So obviously, I talked about it just now. It makes clear to the judge what the world looks like, what problems exist, what measures exist to solve it, why is this still not addressed, or why is the way that it's being addressed right now not adequate. So these are questions you can maybe write down if you want. These oftentimes help me when I'm trying to brainstorm material for my characterization. The second is that it makes clear to yourself what the world looks like, because it's crucial for thinking of a mechanism to explain how that world can change depending on whether the policy is passed or not. And mechanism is something we'll talk about in the next slide. It's basically kind of showing your work, explaining why your policy changes things for the better or worse. Um, and the reason why this is important is because or the reason why characterization is important for this is because, well, if you don't know what the world looks like yourself, then how the heck are you going to know how to change it, right? So you want to really build up the world for yourself, say, here are the issues right now, and here's how we can take these issues and make them gone, right? So that's why characterization is important for thinking of your solutions or your arguments later on. It's a very crucial step that people still kind of struggle with, like a lot of experienced debaters struggle with. So this is what I really want to focus with you guys on. The third is that it grounds your argument in a material reality, right? So it is easier to understand because many arguments that people make intuitively sound nice, right? You know, you guys have probably been in your poli sci tutorials or like any tutorial that you have in class, and you just hear a kid who just saying a bunch of stuff that you can kind of understand, but like you still don't really know what the heck they're talking about. So a lot of arguments, therefore, intuitively sound pretty nice, but they lose value when the person listening doesn't really understand why this applies to real life, and stuff like that. So, for example, right, if the judge that you're kind of presenting your speech to doesn't know anything about like the past issues with like people consuming like laced goods and stuff like that, then they're not going to be really sure why legalizing and taxing marijuana would be something that's necessary if they don't even know that there's a problem existing in the first place. So that's why characterization is important. uh, okay, awesome. If there's no questions in chat, then I'm going to move on. All right, so the next part is called the mechanism. So this is basically saying why the thing that you think will happen. And there can be multiple of these reasons. And I think there should be multiple of these reasons because the world is complex. And the way that I draw the analogy here is that this is very similar to when you do like a math question and your prof or your teacher's kind of just like, you got to show your work, even though you have the right conclusion, I don't know how you got to it. And that's kind of like what you're doing here, where you're basically explaining, well, how is the specific policy that I'm trying to implement? In this case, it is called legalizing taxing marijuana. How does this specific policy change the issues or the impacts from the previous like characterization for the better? So here you can say, why does legalizing marijuana mean that less people will consume laced goods? That's the question that mechanism is trying to answer, right? So the characterization, as we already talked about, lays down the foundation of the argument. So it established that first, people in the status quo consume marijuana through private dealers. And the second, it established that these private dealers are oftentimes unreliable, they're not regulated, sometimes they contain really harmful substances to people. So therefore, after it established these two things, the next step then is to justify why the world will change with this policy. Because if it is a reality that people will consume these goods through private dealers and that these goods are oftentimes laced, then explain to me why legalizing and taxing it is going to change this world at all. So here's an example of what you could say. And obviously, this is like a shortened version of what you would say in a speech, but I think it still highlights it very well, which is basically saying legalizing, taxing, and regulating marijuana means that there are more places to buy it legally, right? Very intuitively true. Similar to how people buy alcohol from LCBO. This also means that the goods sold will be safe because the production will be regulated with safety standards. This means people will be less likely to buy from independent dealers and be harmed by laced goods. And there you go. That's kind of just like a good mechanism, right? Obviously, it's a little bit simplistic. It needs a lot more like, information and like detail to it. But I think this is a good example to highlight. This is how we can take our conception of the status quo and explain how legalizing it changes certain features of the status quo to lead to a better world later on, right? Because we're saying in the status quo, these producers are not regulated. There's no safety standards, similar to like alcohol from LCBO. Therefore, when you legalize and tax and regulate, you have more safety standards. So therefore, people will be safer. And like that's kind of how you get to the final conclusion that less people will buy from independent dealers and be harmed by those goods. So yeah, this is kind of like the idea of like the mechanization. If there's no questions about this specific part, I'll move on. But as a final addition, you should also add characterization wherever necessary. Okay, the next part is the impact. The impact is very similar to a conclusion, and basically it establishes the benefit of the policy, right? And there can be there can be multiple of these, but you might want to choose and focus on one or two really, really important ones. So in this case, you can maybe say the first one is less people are likely to be harmed from laced products, and the second one is you reduce the amount of black market activity with drugs. So we can focus on the first one, right? Less people are likely to be harmed from laced products. That is a very clear impact that exists, an outcome or a conclusion they can derive from the specific mechanism that you were just developing, right? And the reason why this is important is not just, oh, well, you want to tell them like who is going to be harmed, because that is important. But in terms of like debate strategy, the reason why impacting is so crucial is because it establishes a very clear burden or a clear theme in the debate. And this might seem like obscure terms, and we'll have seminars on this later on as well for what burdens and what themes are. But generally speaking, what burdens and themes are right now is basically a point of contention in a debate. That's how you can kind of understand what burdens are, a point of contention or a point of conflict between both sides. So here you're basically saying which side saves more lives. Do you save more lives, or do you have more or less people harmed when people consume laced products, or do you have more or less people harmed when people when people buy from like private dealers? That's kind of like the point of clash between both sides in the debate, or which side helps most people, which side reduces the amount of black market activity the most. Regardless of what impact you choose, the impact that you choose is basically saying, here is what I think is the most important uh, conclusion of the round, and other teams therefore should engage with me on it, and therefore you as the judge should probably evaluate us on it. So for example, if my impact is less people likely to be harmed from laced goods, therefore I imply that the other teams have to engage with me on that specific point, and the judge has to evaluate, the team that wins is the team that proves whichever side sees more lives. That's a little bit long-winded, but I really want to like hammer this in just because I feel like impacting is a little bit underrated as a part of a lot of people's speeches. So make sure you don't skimp out on this. Don't just say like one like sentence for it. Try to develop this more. And then finally, the importance. So importance is basically saying, why is that outcome happening important to consider, or how does that affect people's lives? So you might be wondering, what is the difference between impacting and importance, right? Because they seem to go hand in hand. Well, the difference between these two is that the impact is kind of just telling or having an objective observation of these certain outcomes that arise from certain policies. Whereas the importance is our value statements of explaining, well, given that those outcomes happen, why should you or should you not care about those things? So for example, right, let's say, you were talking to like a judge that's kind of like a sociopath, right? And you say, well, people are going to get harmed from this. People are going to consume laced goods. And the judge just goes like, okay, so what? In which case, then even if you really built up a good argument to explain why people are harmed, if the judge doesn't understand why that harm particularly matters, or that they should evaluate that in the round, then that argument might as well have not been made, because the judge didn't really understand the relevance that it had. So in this case, you have to explain, well, the reason why you should care about, people consuming laced goods is for these reasons. You can list many of them, right? You could say, this is a very big burden on the healthcare system. This leads to pain and suffering. This leads to broken neighborhoods. This leads to people falling into poverty traps, stuff like that, right? There's so many different ways that you could go down this route. You can list many, like a lot of them. But what's important to remember about this is basically just explaining why your impact matters. Always pretend your judge is someone who doesn't know anything about anything. So whenever you want to explain anything, you want to go overkill on it. You want to really go into depth about why certain things matter or don't matter. So for example, here you can say an impact as a result from this policy could be that government is able to collect more tax revenue, or that more business and jobs will be created in this new industry, right? This is an example of an impact that might not be the most significant in the round. Maybe you want to focus more on other impacts, like people consuming these products are generally low-income communities and youth. Maybe they don't have the same access to healthcare, to social services that help with addiction and stuff like that, right? So you want to also pick the impacts that you think are more important too. Because sure, maybe businesses can benefit from this, but is that as significant as being able to prove that you save so many more lives with this, right? So pick and choose. Consider which impacts are the ones that you care about the most, and the importance is basically justifying why you think those impacts are the most important. And then finally, some important notes. Mechanisms, impacts, and importance should represent the majority of the time spent in constructive, just because in constructive. So remember, just because it is true does not mean it is important, and just because it is important does not mean it is true. You want to find the right balance between those things. So you want to make sure you develop the previous parts of your arguments very well for any of those things, two things to be significant. Examples and characterization should exist in all levels of the analysis, but you want to concentrate them to one specific part. So for example, it's important to constantly characterize in your mechanism to provide examples to make sure your argument is still grounded and understandable. So for example, with like the previous motion they were talking about, you could say, you could always sprinkle in, for example, by saying, this policy leads to these outcomes. For example, in a city in the United States where this happened, I don't know, crime rates went down, maybe poverty rates went down. Using the knowledge that you have from reading every day to kind of add context behind it is also very powerful too. So those are like the general notes for it. I'll stop the recording now. Second.